everybody, I'm Mango Thunderslice, and today we're going to be talking about why the flu vaccine is bullshit. Actually, we're going to be talking about a little bit more than that. We're actually going to be talking about the entire foundation of the modern allopathic medical establishment, which basically, as I've said, and Panther has said multiple times, is pretty much the last leg standing of the cabal, right? You know, they don't have the media anymore, the military's been taken away from them, it's a split faction, right? There's basically just the drug running now, the legal and illegal drug trade, right? The heroin trade, the opium trade, and the legal drugs, right? Big pharma and all that shenanigans that goes along with it. A big toxic soup pretending to be the ultimate healing modality the world has ever seen. You know, and the last video seems to have gotten a good reception. Happy to have some new subscribers here. But basically, you know, I had a cranky old man basically accuse me of being an illiterate stoner. And, you know, I love it when people talk shit on me because I'm smoking weed, because there's no other responses that are negative, right? And nobody can lodge a single complaint against any of my arguments or any of the sources that I'm using. It's all just, oh, you're a dumb stoner. Well, I know that if I've got that as my only response that's negative, well, then my arguments are perfect. What's really funny is that I got accused of being illiterate by a guy talking about how horrible and terrible the Rockefellers are. Talking about, you know, basically leaded gasoline and, you know, basically how Standard Oil had the patent for it, and, you know, how they were helping the Nazis. And yeah, I don't know if this person thinks that's news to me, but I gave some news right back at him that the Rockefellers have been up to a lot more than just oil and, you know, a little bit of derivatives and selling it to the Nazis, my friend. And, you know, if you think that their tyranny ended with the Nazis and the you know, communists in Soviet Russia, well, then you're very mistaken. It goes a lot bigger than leaded gasoline. And so I'm going to continue my adventure of literacy today. And I'm going to keep reading this book, AIDS, Opium, Diamonds, and Empire by Dr. Nancy Turner Banks. And, you know, just a preface before I start getting into this chapter, it's a really great chapter, but, you know, I had some other responses of people who didn't like the sound of the book because, you know, Nancy Turner Banks, she's a medical doctor. She's not like a free market libertarian, okay? She is analyzing the effects of what she perceives to be capitalism, and she calls it actually pretty accurately. It's not capitalism, it's financial capitalism. It's crony capitalism. It's this aberration that isn't actually a true capitalist market. You know, so when she uses terms like, oh, this is the free market, you know, it's just calm down. Okay, she's making some very valid points. We don't all have to agree 100% to acknowledge that people are bringing useful information. In the chapter today, chapter 3, the Brothers Flexner, Allopathic Medicine, Lessons Learned from the British East India Company. Starts off with a quote from John Taylor Gatto, The Underground History of American Education. By 1940, the literacy figure for all states stood at 96% for whites, 80% for blacks. Notice that for all the disadvantages blacks labored under, 4 of 5 were nevertheless literate. 6 decades later, at the end of the 20th century, the National Adult Literacy Survey and the National Assessment of Educational Progress say 40% of blacks and 17% of whites can't read at all. Put another way, black illiteracy doubled, white illiteracy quadrupled. Before you think of anything else in regard to these numbers, think this. We spend 3 to 4 times as much real money on schooling as we did 60 years ago, but 60 years ago, virtually everyone, black or white, could read. It's a good one today. 3 brothers. Corruption in the medical business has been a recurrent theme throughout the course of American history. It is likely that John D. Rockefeller learned how lucrative the patent medicine business could be from his father, Old Bill Rockefeller. Old Bill was a known philanderer and itinerant salesman who pawned himself off as a doctor and joined the ranks of patent medicine fakers who hawked their wares from the backs of wagons. Bill's product was a bottle of raw petroleum that he called New Oil. He sold it to those who had cancer and those whom he could make fear that they would have it. For every penny invested, the return was approximately 160 times as much. These profits were breathtaking and made inevitable the addition of chemical drug trafficking business to the already vast production and sales domain of America's largest and most ruthless industrial combine, the Rockefeller Empire. To consolidate the power of their pharmaceutical business and to extend their international reach, the Rockefeller cartel enlisted the support of three brothers. As the 20th century unfolded, the three brothers, Abraham, Simon, and Bernard Flexner, were selected to represent international banking and corporate power. They were strategically placed in pivotal societal institutions to create an American counter-revolution. The idea of free people, independent of banker and state interference, was intolerable and contrary to their free trade philosophy. The idea was to create a society in which the development of mind and character of the young were less important than training and molding, so that the young would become willing instruments for use by others. They early on envisioned turning the country from a production economy into a consuming economy that would be enfolded into a global financial network. This would be managed in stages. The first was to gain control of the levers of power in banking, education, including medical education, the pharmaceutical industry, and the affairs of the state. Abraham and Simon altered and set in place the controls to direct the orientation of medical education and research away from human physiology towards pharmacology. Bernard, who is less well known, was a powerful political manipulator. He was charged with taking control of the affairs of state of the United States under the direction of the organization he helped found, the Council on Foreign Relations. Both the vast resources and the democratic institutions of the United States have been purposely squandered and assaulted piece by piece in a lateral, multi-pronged, persistent attack to create a utopian dream, the New World Order. This New World Order was described by Georgetown professor and historian Carroll Quigley in his 1975 book, Tragedy and Hope, as follows. The powers of financial capitalism had a far-reaching plan, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. The apex of the system was to be the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, a private bank owned and controlled by the world's central banks, which were themselves private corporations. Bernard was also a representative of world Zionism at the Versailles Peace Conference following World War I. He was part of a contingent that demanded impossible financial reparations from the German people, thereby setting the conditions for World War II. However, there was another aspect to the treaty negotiations at Versailles that is seldom discussed. Germany had been winning the war until the United States entered the conflict. President Woodrow Wilson had pledged to the American people to keep them out of this uniquely European affair, but, as usual, an incident was created to inflame the people and push the president into engaging the military. Germany was blamed for an attack on the SS Sussex passenger ferry plying between Dover and Calais with the loss of 38 American lives. This incident led to the declaration of war by the USA against Germany on April 6, 1917. The SS Sussex had actually been concealed in a small port in the north of England, and no American lives had been lost. This intentionally staged deception aligned the USA with Great Britain in World War I and resulted in the crushing defeat of Germany in 1918. Wilson was not particularly politically astute, and fearful that an illicit affair that he had while at Princeton might become common knowledge, capitulated to pressure to enter the war. With public pressure mounted in the media as a result of the Sussex incident, Wilson was unable to resist the warmongers against the will of the American people. He took the country to war. At Versailles, when the Zionist delegation produced what has become known as the Balfour Declaration, Germany realized how she had been betrayed. British Lord Balfour, who had no conceivable right to do this, a member of the secret British Round Table Group, agreed to cede Palestine to the Zionists for using their influence to bring America into the war. The empire would continue. 12 years after the end of this first conflict, the Bank for International Settlements, BIS, was established in Basel, Switzerland by Charles Dawes, vice president under Calvin Coolidge, Owen D. Young, founder of RCA and GE chairman from 1922 to 1939, and Hjalmar Schacht, president of the German Reichsbank. The BIS is referred to by bankers as the central bank for the central banks. The BIS only deals with other central banks. All of its meetings are held in secret and involve the top central bankers from around the world. Former head of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, would go to the BIS headquarters in Basel 10 times a year for these meetings. Louis T. McFadden, chairman of the House Banking and Currency Committee from 1920 to 1931, commented that during the First Depression, American dollars were being spent on rebuilding Germany. After World War I, Germany fell into the hands of the German international bankers. Those bankers bought her, and now they own her, lock, stock, and barrel. They have purchased her industries, they have mortgages on her soil, they control her production, they control all of her public utilities. Through the Federal Reserve Board, $30 billion of American money has been pumped into Germany. The spending that has taken place in Germany, modernistic dwellings, her great planetariums, her gymnasiums, her swimming pools, her fine public highways, her perfect factories, all of this was done with our money. All of this was given to Germany through the Federal Reserve Board. On October 3, 1936, Congressman McFadden suddenly succumbed to an intestinal flu. He had 2 previous attempts on his life. He had suffered an earlier poisoning and he had shots fired at him. American intervention in World War I established a pattern that led America into the Second World War in 1941. If the United States has not entered the war in Europe in 1917, World War I would likely have ended in a stalemate that would have engendered a balance of power in Europe. American intervention completely shattered the old balance of power and sowed the seeds of inevitable future conflict in the dark soil of Versailles. The resentment from conditions set by this treaty, the economic hardships created by the conditions of the Dawes Plan, followed by the Young Plan, and finally the financing of Hitler and the rearming of Germany by Wall Street bankers, including Prescott Bush, the father of George H.W. Bush and grandfather to George W. Bush, led directly to the outbreak of World War II. World War II led directly to more world financial consolidation that occurred at a meeting in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Bretton Woods. Possibly the most significant and least discussed outcome of the World War II was the Bretton Woods Agreement. Before the ink was dry on the peace treaty, 730 delegates from 44 allied nations met at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to set up a structure for a central world bank that would eventually come to dominate and control the financial markets of the entire planet. The Bretton Woods Agreement established a post-war international monetary system of convertible currencies, fixed exchange rates, and free trade. However, an underlying reason for this agreement was to build an international system for currency speculators to take advantage of interest rate differentials among nations. This open system would allow any speculator who had the means, think George Soros, to attack and devalue the currency of any country. The agreement was set up in such a way that the institutions it established had not only enormous leverage over debtor nations, but also a way to attack the sovereignty of almost any nation by providing credit financing. To facilitate these objectives, the agreement created 2 international institutions, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the World Bank. It also established the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, which Congress approved in 1947. The GATT would later become known as the World Trade Organization. What the IMF and the World Bank essentially did was repeat on a world scale what the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 had done in the United States. As the old military forms of colonialism were no longer useful, the Bretton Woods Agreement put a new, more sophisticated and damaging form of financial colonialism in place. These agreements were the stepping stones to a new world economic order that would plunge formerly sovereign and emerging nations into debt slavery to the financial institutions controlled by European and American central bankers. The Bretton Woods Agreement has allowed a small number of bankers to run a worldwide fraud, extortion, and protection racket called globalization. The agreement was designed to free the international banks from the constraints of national democratic interference. Using the might of the Bretton Woods Agreement to concentrate wealth into fewer and fewer hands, the international banking institutions have come to determine the internal domestic policies of practically every nation on the globe in favor of global corporate structure. What they cannot obtain by economic extortion, they use the military apparatus of states to take by force. This international white-collar crime network has become expert at propping up savage local talent, such as Mobutu Sese Seko in the Congo, Suharto in Indonesia, Pol Pot in Cambodia, or Pinochet in Chile, whom they have trained to carry out their will and take the blame when their policy initiatives have become intolerably oppressive. It is a cleverly ruthless system. Ain't that the truth? Bretton Woods and the transference of wealth. Joseph Stiglitz was chief economist at the World Bank from 1997 to 1999. He was forced out for criticizing several key IMF U.S. policies. His observation on the World Bank's impact on democracy is telling. The IMF likes to go about its business without outsiders asking too many questions. In theory, the fund supports democratic institutions in the nations it assists. In practice, it undermines the democratic process by imposing policies. Officially, of course, the IMF doesn't impose anything. It negotiates the conditions for receiving aid. But all the power in the negotiations is on one side, the IMF's, and the fund rarely allows sufficient time for broad consensus building or even widespread consultations with either parliaments or civil society. Sometimes the IMF dispenses with the pretense of openness altogether and negotiates secret agreements. Stiglitz's criticism is not unfounded, because the consequences of the Bretton Woods Agreement and the development of these uber banking structures was the refinement of a very simple technique which has been consistently and successfully employed to transfer wealth and commonwealth into fewer hands, and to ignore public needs so that the public has a negative return on investments without having participated in the decisions that directly impact their current and future lives. The technique employed, fractional reserve banking, is fairly straightforward. Money in the form of credit, most of which is created out of thin air, is loaned to various countries with the assumption that the money that never existed will be repaid by the countries with interest. A portion of the money flows through a designated, corrupted leader installed or controlled by the powers of the lending institution. The lending institution insists that the borrowing country use and pay for advisors recommended by the bank. The leaders of various countries are drawn into the scheme by a system of kickback payments and other perks that bring them considerable wealth, and an escape plan to a safe haven or an American or European jail cell when they start skimming the profits or begin to lose control of the country, as must inevitably happen because of the harsh policies they must implement. Most of the money never goes to the borrowing country, but to the corporations of the former Western colonial power who contract to do the required work. Few of the work projects develop improvements for the ordinary citizen who pays the tab in excess taxes and fees. The penalty to leaders who refuse to cooperate is assassination, covertly initiated civil disturbances, or war. Such counterinsurgency techniques are masterfully orchestrated and usually successful. The ordinary people of the country receiving the loan are left to pay the debt, which becomes increasingly burdensome. The lending institutions demand that the countries institute structural adjustment programs to repay the loans. The demand always includes the provision that the countries drastically cut social expenditures, especially in health, infrastructure, and education. A predictable downward economic spiral ensues. The IMF and World Bank have the leverage to wreck the economy of any target country, as they are currently doing to the United States and as they did to Argentina in 2001. This is called spreading democracy, or in international terms, the Washington Consensus. Stiglitz could have been talking about the 2008 congressional approval of the $700 billion bailout of Wall Street financial firms whose mechanisms of implementation have been shrouded in secrecy when he commented on just that problem with the World Bank. Bad economics was only a symptom of the real problem, secrecy. Smart people are more likely to do stupid things when they close themselves off from outside criticism and advice. If there's one thing I've learned in government, it's that openness is most essential in those realms where expertise seems to matter most. If the IMF and Treasury had invited greater scrutiny, their folly might have become much clearer much earlier. Critics from the right, such as Martin Feldstein, chairman of Reagan's Council of Economic Advisors, and George Shultz, Reagan's Secretary of State, joined Jeff Sachs, Paul Krugman, and me in condemning the policies. But with the IMF insisting its policies were beyond reproach, and with no institutional structure to make it pay attention, our criticisms were of little use. More frightening, even internal critics, particularly those with direct democratic accountability, were kept in the dark. This scenario has been played out again and again over the last 50 years as the anticipated result of the Bretton Woods Agreement that created a world economic order. The New World Order has been structured in such a way that it undermines the sovereignty of every nation in their grasp. The World Bank and IMF now dictate how public money is spent. Their structural adjustment programs have intentionally left most of the planet's people mired in abject poverty and living in shanty towns on the outskirts of Oz. Half of the planet's 6 billion people go to bed hungry each night. Scorecard of daily deaths. 1. Terrorism, less than 10. 2. Starvation/malnutrition under age 5, 40,000. From its founding in 1920 until 1961, every Secretary of State was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations except Cordell Hull and James Burns. Other more recent members include Hillary Clinton, Condoleezza Rice, Madeleine Albright, Christopher Warren, James Baker III, Lawrence Eagleburger, George Shultz, Alexander Haig, Cyrus Vance, and Henry Kissinger. This list of characters goes far to explain how the United States went from the Monroe Doctrine to a world empire. It also explains why American foreign policy may meander from president to president, but its trajectory remains constant. These selected few have involved the American people in international intrigues that shocked the country out of her isolationist cocoon and robbed her of her resources. By following the policies and involving themselves in countless foreign intrigues that benefit a set of privileged utopian elitists, the United States has gone from being the biggest creditor nation to the largest debtor nation in history. The Council on Foreign Relations has persisted in gradually advancing a globalization, capital market liberalization, and privatization agenda. They have managed to succeed by strategic deception against the American people. They consistently promote various trade agreements that have subverted the Constitution and neutralized the power of the representative body of the people, which is easy enough to do since the Congress has been self-emasculated by its own corruptibility. The Council has succeeded in making the idea of the sovereignty of the people an arcane notion. During the autumn of 2008, there was a collective realization in the United States that the country was in the most serious fiscal crisis since the Great Depression. The heads of countries that expanded from the G7 to the G20 descended on the capital city of this weakened nation to demand oversight of U.S. domestic financial structures. This would have been unthinkable just 10 years ago. Current financial difficulties will soon be the excuse to dismantle the social safety net of the nation, including Social Security and government health programs that have caused so much consternation since they were instituted under Franklin Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson. The same structural adjustment that has hindered much of the developing world has hit the shores of the United States like a tidal wave. The people of the U.S. still think they won World War II. It has taken them 60 years and a collapse of their economy to come to an understanding that they are at the mercy of the Bretton Woods Agreement and the same bankers who are killing the aspirations of developing world economies. This is the legacy of Bernard Flexner. It will come to have great meaning once one begins to understand that the abject poverty of half the planet's people has been systematically planned. Over 100 million Europeans were killed during the last century, and possibly twice as many other people in the two major wars used to create the climate for the rise of these new world structures and organizational institutions. If the European elite would initiate wars that killed 100 million of their own people to establish this system, why would they not continue to eliminate others who stand in the way of their long-held plans? They destroyed the city of Dresden, a non-military target, and dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japanese civilians. More recently, they have killed millions in Iraq and Afghanistan and in the ongoing wars in the Sudan and Congo. Simon Flexner. Simon Flexner was trained as a pathologist and installed as director of the laboratories at the newly formed Rockefeller Institute. The Rockefeller Institute, from its inception, was deeply involved in the racist and elitist eugenics movement that changed most of its overt tactics, but has never ceased to exist, after the excesses of its ideology were exposed to the world in the aftermath of World War II. Rockefeller money supported the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, eugenics, and human heredity that spearhead the ethnic cleansing movement in Germany. Simon was a forerunner in positioning 20th century medical research to focus on viral causes of disease. The obsession with viruses led directly to the failed Nixon war on cancer and the failed HIV causes AIDS hypothesis. There will be further discussion about Simon and the men he hired to work at the Rockefeller Institute and their association with the eugenics movement in the chapter on pellagra. The last brother, Abraham, became an education expert for the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. This organization set in motion the downward spiral of the quality of U.S. education, including medical education. The Flexner Report on Medical Education. It has been almost 100 years since Abraham Flexner, who had never set foot of a medical school, was called on to produce a document for Rockefeller and Carnegie interests evaluating the teaching of medicine in the U.S. He prepared a report in 1910 that is known as the Flexner Report on Medical Education in the United States and Canada, a report to the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. By 1918, of 650 medical schools, only 50 remained, mainly those that would agree to promote pharmaceutical drugs as the mainstay of therapy. The report did point out that many of the inadequacies of medical education at the time and it proposed changes, some of which were sound. But from the beginning, the emphasis was placed on pharmacology, radiation, and surgery. All other modes of therapy that would in any way compete with this model would thereafter be branded as quackery, even when, and especially if, they worked. Of course, the Carnegie and Rockefeller people made sure that they only hired to the top positions of the medical campuses those who by temperament and interest were ideal propagators of the drug-oriented science that dominates American medicine. The end result of this report was to congeal the philanthropy of the Rockefeller and Carnegie foundations into a money mafia and radical monopoly that crushed healing modalities that would not subscribe to their use of chemical drugs and their scientific medicine. Rockefeller and Carnegie money was used to develop medical schools that are experts at psychological conditioning of white coat repeaters who have been trained by long years of study and chronic fatigue to engage comfortably in totalitarian behaviors that would be criminal without the sanction of the state. Their role is handmaiden to the pyramidal pharmaceutical industry, whose goals they are unwittingly trained to serve. Enormous iatrogenic mischief and health damage has been caused by intentionally creating a widespread belief among ordinary people that they cannot cope with their own illnesses except by calling on the ministrations of a trained and duly state-licensed medical expert. As a result, many aspects of traditional folk medicine, homeopathy, and naturopathy are shunned by people who continually seek relief only from the neighborhood pharmacy with its various patented nostrums. The loss of faith in the healing power of nature and a dose of common sense has given the medical and pharmaceutical industries a license to kill and the money to buy get-out-of-jail-free cards. The pharmaceutical industry literally gets away with murder by spending massive amounts of excess profits lobbying politicians at every level to ensure their indemnity from adverse consequences of their products. As a result, over 100,000 Americans are killed on an annual basis by their products. Over the last 10 years, about 3,000 Americans have died from terrorist attacks, but during the same period, over 1 million died as the consequence of taking a pharmaceutical drug. The medical profession's drive to restrain people's health freedom has extended to the AMA, American Medical Association, and their call for legislation that would challenge home birth, which has been proven safe, by women and could result in criminal child abuse or neglect charges leveled against them. Children have been snatched from parents who refused vaccinations or a recommended medical therapy, especially toxic and deadly HIV drugs. At least since 1996, parents have been charged with child neglect for failing to vaccinate their children with all government-recommended vaccines, and the CDC has used taxpayer dollars to mount assaults to counter parent-led informed consent initiatives in several states. Children are regularly denied access to state schools if their parents have challenged the ever-expanding roster of vaccines they are required to take. For girls, the latest push for a mandatory HPV, human papillomavirus, vaccine, the total comes to 56 shots for 22 vaccines. Government allocation of police powers to public health officials to enforce mandatory vaccinations have given drug companies the assurance of predictable rising profits, more of the free market at work. This is a prime example of how the so-called free enterprise system uses the state to ensure its profitability at the expense of the most vulnerable population. Forced use of drugs and vaccines on children is coercive, draconian, and patently anti-democratic and unconstitutional health policy. Giving the state authority and access where it does not belong, in the most sacred of spaces, your bloodstream, is a creeping encroachment on individual sovereignty. The power that the state has allocated to the pharmaceutical industry now threatens our privacy, our liberty, and the biological integrity of future generations. In 1950, approximately 7,500 children in the United States were diagnosed with mental disorders. As the number of drugs directed at children for mental disorders increased, the number so diagnosed has risen concomitantly. That number is at least 8 million today, and most receive some form of medication. John Taylor Gatto, an experienced but currently retired New York City teacher and social commentator, noted in his book, Weapons of Mass Instruction, the terrible effect of a milestone that has transformed American education. The Behavioral Science Teacher Education Project, or B-STEP for short. This program clearly sets down government policy for compulsory schooling and outlines intended reforms for enforcement in the U.S. after 1967. Institutional schooling will be required to impersonally manipulate the future of an America in which each individual will receive at birth a multi-purpose identification number that will enable employers and other controllers to keep track of the common mass and to expose it to direct or subliminal influence when necessary. Few will be able to maintain control over their own opinions. Chemical experimentation on minors will become normal procedure, a point foreshadowing of Ritalin, Adderall, and other chemical interventions. By 1988, the government began pushing parents to request to have social security numbers assigned to their children at the time of the completion of the birth certificate. It is still currently claimed that the assignment of social security numbers to infants is voluntary, but like the income tax, because it was neither ratified nor an apportioned tax, started out as a voluntary tax, this social security number business will soon have the force of law. This covert control of the population with forced vaccinations and mandated medical treatments was the objective of Abraham Flexner's intended goal in his educational reform work for Rockefeller interests. It has been useful to dumb down and infantilize society into docile complacency for use as pawns in the service of both business and the political state. Once the dumb are wished into existence, as was expressed in Rockefeller's General Education Board's Occasional Paper No. 1, they serve valuable functions. As a danger to themselves and others, they have to be watched, classified, disciplined, trained, medicated, sterilized, ghettoized, cajoled, coerced, and jailed, all at a profit. Thus, their needs demand the creation of a new level of bureaucracy that serves no productive purpose. The General Education Board's Occasional Paper No. 1 was first published in 1912 as an essay, The Country School of Tomorrow. In our dream, people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hands. The present educational conventions, intellectual and character education fade from our minds, and unhampered by tradition, we work for our own good upon goodwill upon a grateful and responsive folk. We shall not try to make these people or any of their children into philosophers or men of learning or men of science. We have not to raise them up from among them authors, educators, poets, or men of letters. We shall not search for embryo great artists, painters, musicians, nor lawyers, doctors, preachers, politicians, statesmen, of whom we will have ample supply. The task we set before ourselves is a very simple as well as very beautiful one. We will organize our children and teach them to do in a perfect way the things in their mothers the things their fathers and mothers are doing in an imperfect way. The Flexner Report on medical education was another level in this planned restructuring of society. It was based on the German model of scientifically based medical training. The great facade behind this vaunted policy was immensely more complex. It included adopting an amalgam of ancient religious doctrine, utopian philosophy, and the European Asiatic strong state politics mixed together and distilled. However, modern German tradition always assigned universities the primary task of directly serving industry and the political state. But that was a radical contradiction of American tradition to serve the individual and the family. The medical, pharmaceutical, and insurance industries were organized early in the last century by complicit minions of Rockefeller and Carnegie to serve the interests of the corporate state rather than individual Americans. By now, such thinking seems mundane, but they kept their purpose well hidden, because Americans at that time knew that these were incendiary ideas designed to undermine civil society. Not understanding how these systems were intentionally developed brings consternation and grief to many whose only option in resisting the excesses and failures of this established order is to wage long and expensive fights through an increasingly antagonistic court system. This sets a high barrier to imposing limitations on corporate criminal behavior that can only be addressed in civil courts. While the system is designed to catalog the life and movement of the individual from birth until death, with a series of numbers and ratings, there is no reciprocal oversight of the watchers. The idea of contracts freely executed between free men has become history. The problem is that through political bribery, called lobbying, the political class has long ago abdicated its responsibilities to the people. No one is watching the watchers. According to Gary Null in Death by Medicine, iatrogenic medicine is the #1 cause of death in the United States, outpacing both cancer and heart disease. That is a statistic that will never be allowed to seep into the consciousness of the American psyche. At the top of the pyramidal structures that control the banking, military, and medical industrial complexes are the interests that currently control medical education, the pharmaceutical industry, the public health sector via the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, the CDC, the NIH, and the Department of Agriculture, all of which are contributing to the continuing decline of the general health of the American people. Although the U.S. spends more per capita on healthcare than any other country on the planet, it ranks 50th of 223 countries in terms of life expectancy. Since the beginning of the last century, the dynamic of the United States has been away from representative democracy and limited capitalism to more and more centralized control in every aspect of the society. The country has been weaned away from the values of self-reliance and independent thinking to become a nation who demands experts to guide their every move. The idea of self-selected oligarchs making decisions for the masses was spelled out by Walter Lippmann in 2 books, Public Opinion in 1922 and The Phantom Public in 1925. These books called for a restriction on public debate because Lippmann, speaking for the political class, concluded that it was impossible for the dumbed-down public to know what its best interests were. The common public would have to be neutralized in the name of democracy for this expert society. In the Lippmann worldview, common people traded in their right to be heard on policy matters in exchange for being taken care of. Nowhere was this paternalistic philosophy instituted with more vigor than in the training of allopathic physicians. Allopathic medicine. Farben was Hitler and Hitler was Farben. Senator Homer T. Bone to the Senate Committee on Military Affairs, June 4, 1943. Abraham Flexner was recruited by Rockefeller interests to specifically promote allopathic medicine and turn it into a very clever marketing vehicle to sell the overpriced, patented, and anti-life pharmaceuticals largely controlled today by the spawn of Rockefeller interests. The combine became globalized after they partnered with Germany's IG Farben. On the eve of World War II, IG Farben was the largest chemical manufacturing enterprise in the world and enjoyed a monopoly on chemical products manufactured in Germany. Without the capital supplied by Wall Street, there would have been no IG Farben, no Hitler, and no World War II. IG Farben is of particular interest in the formation of the Nazi state because Farben directors materially helped Hitler and the Nazis to power in 1933. Directors of the firm included not only German but also American financiers. Their assignment was to make Germany self-sufficient in rubber, gasoline, lubricating oils, magnesium, fibers, tanning agents, fats, and explosives. German IG made an alliance with Rockefeller's Standard Oil in order to control important patents and to cover Standard Oil's support for Hitler's Reich. After Pearl Harbor, American IG decided to camouflage its German parentage and sympathies with the help of Standard Oil. After purchasing an undisclosed number of shares in the Ozalid Corporation, Schering & Company, Mission Corporation, Monsanto Chemical, Aluminum Corporation, Drug Incorporated, Dow Chemical, Antidollar Indiana, Standard Oil of California, and the DuPont Company, it changed its name to General Aniline and Film Corporation. It took over bodily the privately owned Hoffman-LaRoche Company and multiple other smaller drug companies. Now Rockefeller interests were positioned to do what they did best, create another cartel. This time it was the dual control of allopathic medical colleges and the chemical and pharmaceutical industry. It was a masterful hegemonic stroke. The empire of allopathic medicine was created. It is the dominant medicine practiced in the United States and has been exported to most of the world. Few traditional cultures have been spared the rampage of this civilizing force. Ivan Illich observed 30 years ago that iatrogenic medicine is a radical monopoly which feeds upon itself. It reinforces a morbid society in which the social control of the population by the medical system turns into a principal economic activity. Illich's observations have proved prescient because in 2008 expenditures on healthcare accounted for 16% of GDP and are expected to rise to 4.2 trillion in 2016, or 20% of GDP. Like the banking cartels created at Bretton Woods, need ever-expanding markets and manufactured wars to keep their debt-based fiat monetary system alive, the allopathic medical cartel needs manufactured diseases to sustain the profits that they have come to enjoy. It is such an imbalanced system that it disseminates false information about the nature of some pathologies under the rubric of the scientific method and uses the power of government agencies such as the FDA to limit consumer access to information about the health benefits of natural products and appropriate biological compensatory therapies. The FDA has been accused of running an extortion racket against the natural products market. Cherry products, for example, cannot link to scientific articles explaining the simple biological fact that cherries ease inflammation in humans. When cherry growers began to cite this research, the FDA came down hard on 29 of them and threatened legal action if they did not remove the scientific evidence about cherries from their websites. Such links are considered drug claims by the FDA. At the same time that the FDA was harassing cherry farmers, it was approving the Merck drug Vioxx that led directly to 100,000 heart attacks and to 55,000 deaths. Congressman Ron Paul, who is an obstetrician gynecologist, introduced a bill that would curb restrictions imposed by the FDA and the FTC, Federal Trade Commission, regarding health claims for dietary supplements. The Health Freedom Protection Act would prevent the FDA from censoring truthful claims about the curative or preventative effect of dietary supplements. Only with extreme pressure from constituents would such a bill have a hope of passing in the current climate of unregulated corporate money flowing into Congress. This was written in 2009, but still relevant. The constructed medical system thrives on treating the symptoms of chronic diseases with toxic and expensive chemicals while ignoring the body's natural biochemistry, biorhythms, and electrical conductivity. The current system was created from the knowledge gained by ruling elites through the management and development of the first major global corporation, the British East India Company. Modern history cannot be understood without gaining insight into the dynamic role that this company played in the industrial development of the West, the rise of communist China, and the initiation of a global agenda espoused as inevitable by intellectual, political, and business elites. It is noteworthy that the most important commodities for capitalist growth were exotic chemicals and drugs, from tobacco to opium. Without drugs and drug economies, financial capitalism in its present state would not have come into being. The British East India Company and opium. The BEIC's premier product was opium. The British had nothing to trade that the Chinese people wanted or needed, but British avarice was boundless. Britain is an island that has been able to buy the veneer of civility. However, beneath this thin veneer pulses the heart of their barbarian ancestry. When the Romans first encountered them, they had no written language, wore trousers at a time when men in the civilized world wore tunics, were loud and ferocious, painted their bodies blue, and with their white faces and red hair were said to look as bad as they smelled. This is pretty racist, I gotta admit. Their pretense at civilization is only outpaced by their penchant for political intrigue. Also, there were highly literate civilizations on the British Isles when Rome showed up, okay? Their desire for the sophisticated Chinese products of fine tea, silks, and pottery created an enormous trade imbalance for them. They had nothing but silver with which the Chinese cared to barter. Unable to curb their appetite for Chinese material goods and seeking a way to bend the Chinese to their will, they hit upon the idea of creating a demand for the addictive drug opium. The Dutch East India Company had earlier done this free trade in Malaysia. Opium was a product that brought grief to the user and social disruption to targeted cultures. Heavy users of opium had an average life expectancy of 5 years. It is now known that opiates have an inhibitory effect on the immune system. They can decrease the production of lymphocytes and have been shown to increase cancer progression in animals. Opiates activate the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal HPA axis that causes production of noradrenaline and glucocorticoids that can cause more stress on the immune system. While 18th century businessmen did not know the science of the metabolic consequences of chronic opium use, they were aware of its addictive qualities and the deleterious effects it had on the user's health. The product was chosen for commercialization for these very reasons. The people running the opium enterprise learned two major lessons from addicting the Chinese to opiates: that narcotizing drugs can weaken an otherwise impermeable society and corrupt it internally, making it ripe for control, and that enormous profits can be made by creating two types of addicts: those who physically crave your product and those who financially crave perverse rewards from destroying others. These were lessons not lost on the elites of Britain and the United States, who ran this dirty business and who have been in charge of one of the largest global enterprises ever since: the worldwide control and distribution of narcotics. Both drug cultures, legal and illegal, as well as the global monetary system that uses drug profits to prop itself up, promote poverty, war, and genocide as an economic model. Given this economic model and the physical and psychological devastation that it created for the Chinese and is now creating in the United States and around the world, it should come as no surprise to any who have bothered to observe its far-reaching consequences that creating a disease category, AIDS, or acquired immune deficiency syndrome, was predictable. When the products of the global drug trade started to be marketed in a spectacular way during and after the Vietnam War to the baby boom population and their offspring, some explanation will be needed for why so many young people in the prime of their lives would become sick and die. The baby boom generation was the age cohort that had first been introduced to the birth control pill and the idea of sexual freedom. This was a social revolution that altered and loosened social mores. The sexual revolution combined with the drug epidemic was bound to lead to medical consequences. There was no better way to camouflage the consequences of these social phenomena than by hiding behind a sex and blood plague, especially one that came out of Africa. The nature and expansiveness of the drug economy and its deep penetration into American culture had to remain hidden. AIDS is a syndrome that arose out of the confluence of global drug running and global medical, social, and economic policies created with intent and malice aforethought at the highest levels. It is the result of the Bretton Woods Agreement signed in New Hampshire in 1944 that came about because of the Versailles Treaty negotiated by Bernard Flexner, the eugenics policies begun under the tutelage of Simon Flexner of the Rockefeller Institute, and the development of allopathic medicine that evolved from Abraham Flexner's Rockefeller Report on Medical Education. The policies set in motion by the Flexners continue to create more problems for the world than they have solved. It's a good book, man. Good book. You know, I don't know what more I got to say about that. Flu vaccine is bullshit. If you trust anything these people make, you're the greatest fool of them all. But people want to say this plant is the worst thing about my message. Well, then I consider that a resounding victory, ladies and gentlemen. That's my video for this week, or at least today. Hope you guys have a great day, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.